Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Andrew Del Banco. He is the Alexander Hamilton Professor of American Studies at Columbia University, the author of many notable books, including College, Melville, The Death of Satan, Required Reading, The Real American Dream, and The Puritan Ordeal. He was recently appointed president of the Teagle Foundation, which supports liberal education for college students of all backgrounds. Winner of the Great Teacher Award from the Society of Columbia Graduates, he is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. In 2001, Andrew Del Banco was named by Time as America's Best Social Critic. In 2012, President Obama presented him with the National Humanities Medal. Dr. Del Banco, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
This is a super book, very detailed and vivid. The book is called The War Before the War, Fugitive Slaves and the Struggle for America's Soul from Revolution to the Civil War. And I'd just like to start where you did by looking at Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and those beautiful words that are held in almost awe, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, which of course is not strictly true for all Americans, and Lincoln knew that. In fact, speaking in Chicago, when he admitted slavery among us in 1858, he also said that we could not get our Constitution unless we permitted slavery, and that's a big deal for this whole book's context, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And my point in beginning with Lincoln is to suggest that when he spoke about the nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, he was speaking, of course, about the Declaration of Independence. And he said many times in his career that he never had a political idea that did not come from the Declaration of Independence. But the reality is, and it's a reality that Lincoln well understood, that the country itself as a political entity, the nation, was created not by the Declaration, but by the Constitution. And the Constitution contained in it several protections for the institution of slavery. The reality was, at the time, and Lincoln knew this too, that if the delegates from the southern states, where slavery was fundamental to their economy and their culture, were going to sign on to a compact with the northern states and call themselves one united nation, they were going to have to receive certain guarantees that the interest they had in human property, which was a very significant interest for them, would be protected. And the book tells the story of how the first element in the Constitution that was put there for the protection of slavery, namely the Fugitive Slave Clause, which attempted to guarantee that if an enslaved human being attempted to flee from slavery by going from a slave state to a free state, that person would have to be returned, in the language of the Constitution, to the person to whom service or labor was due. That element in the Constitution is the first step in a long story that leads, in my view, all the way to the Civil War. So Lincoln knew this. And he knew that the nation was born in compromise, and that sooner or later this compromise would have to be confronted.
Mm-hmm. And we want to get to the Fugitive Slave Act that Millard Fillmore signed into law in 1850, but you mentioned the Constitution Clause, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, and it doesn't refer specifically to the word slavery, but rather to indentured servants. No person held in service.
Right. I mean, that is true that at the time of the Constitution, there were a significant number of apprentices and indentured servants who had contractual obligations to their employers, and that clause referred to them as well. But everybody understood that the fundamental thrust of that clause was to protect slave property. I mean, when Charles Cotesworth Pinckney went back to Charleston to try to convince his fellow Carolinians to support the Constitution, he said, "We have received assurance that we can recover our slaves from anywhere in America where they might seek refuge. And this is an assurance that we did not have before." Therefore, you should support this Constitution. That was the real thrust of that clause.
Yeah, and that was important, but the fact that the language remained a little euphemistic was in part how they got this compromise through, especially to some of the founding fathers who were very conflicted, who thought slavery was bad, but they had their own slaves and weren't willing to give them up. Right? That's
quite right. I mean, if you look at the great Virginians, I mean, Thomas Jefferson wrote powerful words about his difficulties with the institution of slavery. He said, "The spirit of the master is abating, the spirit of the slave is rising from the dust." He said, when I consider that God's justice does not sleep forever, I tremble for my country. And his friend and near neighbor James Madison asserted that he was opposed to the idea of putting into the Constitution the idea of property in men. So it's quite true that some of the slave owners, particularly the Virginians, recognized that the idea of slavery was fundamentally at odds with the notion of a republic based on the proposition of human liberty. And yet the reality was, and this was particularly clear to the representatives from South Carolina and Georgia, the reality was that there wasn't going to be any Constitution if there weren't some protection built in for the slave property. Yeah. So you're quite right. They didn't use the word slave in the Constitution, but the reality of slavery was in the Constitution in several places, not just in the Fugitive Slave Clause.
Uh-huh. So another word that I got introduced to, was, speaking of vocabulary, was comity. Let's talk about comity and how we weren't achieving it at that time.
Right. Well, it's a word we don't use a lot, but I think everybody, when you talk about it, realize what it means. I mean, you've got a complicated country, and the states are sort of semi-sovereign entities, and they have laws of their own. But if you're going to have a coherent, functional nation, then the laws of one state have to be respected by the citizens of another state. That turned out to be a dicey problem when, as Madison said, the laws of the several states, he put it very nicely, were uncharitable to one another. What he meant by that was that in some states, slavery was legal, and in other states, slavery was on the route to becoming illegal. So that raises the question of what is the status of a person who goes from one such state to another. Now, the word comity refers to the idea that, we're going to respect one another's legal principles so that we can agree to do business together. In reality, it didn't work out that way. So I tell one brief anecdote. Pierce Butler, another of the delegates from South Carolina to the Constitutional Convention, he's in Philadelphia in the 1790s. Pennsylvania had passed a law stating that any slave who was in residence in Pennsylvania for more than 6 months was automatically free. So the representatives from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society come to Mr. Butler's door one day in Philly, and they say, listen, we note that you've had a slave, I believe his name was Ben, living with you, and he's been here for more than 6 months, so we're here to tell you that he's not your slave anymore. And Pierce Butler's response is, I'm a citizen of South Carolina. What have the laws of Pennsylvania got to do with me? Mm-hmm. And there you have the issue of comity in a nutshell. How are you going to have one coherent country if the laws of some states are conflicting with the laws of others? And the politicians wrestled with this in a variety of ways for 75 years, and the issue of slavery was not resolved, of course, until after the Civil War with the 13th Amendment, which declared that there would be no more slavery or involuntary servitude anywhere in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Now, during this time in the 1700s, the late 1700s, a lot of the northern states were getting rid of slavery, although one might argue that some of the work that was done in factories was equally as demanding. But there was a lot of difficulty determining such things as when someone entered Pennsylvania. Did they enter as an escaped slave, or were they brought by their master to the state.
That's right.
That's a different.
That's right. And a number of legal cases turned on that kind of question. So Massachusetts, for instance, in the 1830s, Justice Lemuel Shaw of the Supreme Court made a ruling in a case where an enslaved child had been brought into Massachusetts, that child was no longer enslaved because the laws of Massachusetts didn't recognize the condition of slavery. 15 years later, the same judge, and that first decision made him very popular with abolitionists, as you can imagine. But 15 years later, the same judge rules that a fugitive slave must be returned to the state of origin because of the Fugitive Slave Law clause of the Constitution. So he made a distinction, as you were just suggesting, between slaves who were brought into the state by their masters and slaves that fled by their own will or volition into a free state, seeking to escape the obligations. So the courts were tangled up with these kind of issues for the better part of half a century.
And those court cases are interesting because there was many a judge who philosophically thought that slavery was immoral, but they were bound by the Constitution to follow the law.
Well, that's right. And I was very struck in doing the reading for this book how many times I came across judges, even lawyers, who were representing slave owners trying to retrieve their property, saying in one and the same breath, on the one hand, the Constitution requires this, and I'm here to argue for the enforcement of the constitutional clause. On the other hand, personally, I'm repulsed by this. Personally, I wish I never saw another fugitive being returned to labor. Now, this, I know a few people in the lawyering business, and even a few people who sit on the bench, and it's inevitable that you will feel at one time or another that law and justice aren't the same thing, that law and justice come into conflict with each other. And that created hard problems for people of goodwill who felt that, if we didn't have the Constitution and we didn't have the courts and we didn't have an agreement on what the law said, we didn't have a country. We didn't have a nation. The next step would be anarchy, chaos. On the other hand, enforcing a law like the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 was a very hard thing to swallow for some of the judges who, in fact, enforced it.
Now there's a lot of rationalization that goes on in this book, and you have some vivid descriptions of how slaves were shipped and how awful their existence was, and how many died en route on the way to wherever they were being enslaved, and that there's a great deal of detail in the book about that. But I did want to touch on another subject with you, because so much of so-called science, biology, anthropology, and so on, suggested that blacks were inferior.
Right. Well, yeah. So, people have a great ability. You use the word rationalize. People have a great ability to rationalize their own behavior. So as slave owners came more and more under pressure from the anti-slavery movement, you find arguments from science, or what I would call pseudoscience, that black people, their brains are smaller, or their instinctual life is stronger than their intellectual life, or look at them, they're intellectually behind their white brethren. Well, a big surprise if every slave-owning state has laws on the books forbidding black people from learning how to read and write. Not too much of a surprise that their exercise of the English language is likely to be less sophisticated than those who've been beneficiaries of education. So the sciences kind of backed up the view that it's legitimate, it's natural, it's determined by nature itself that some people should be slaves and some people should be slave owners. Religion was invoked to the same to the same purpose. Oh, look, there were slaves in the Old Testament. And there are passages in the Bible saying that the runaway slave must be returned to his master. Well, the reality is there are other passages in the same Bible that suggest that the runaway slave should not be returned to his master. And many anti-slavery ministers argued that the whole spirit of Christianity, all the teachings of Christ himself, run contrary to the idea that one human being can be owned and constrained by another human being. So, I believe in the importance of ideas. I certainly believe in the importance of science, and I respect the importance of religion. But I think we also have to recognize that people are capable of using whatever text they prefer, whatever interpretation they might find favorable to their own circumstances. There's a great passage in Uncle Tom's Cabin, the anti-slavery novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe, where she's got a clear-eyed Southerner. He's a slave owner, and he recognizes that slavery is basic to the culture of the South. But he says, if all of a sudden cotton became worthless, let's imagine that somebody came along and came up with some other textile material that didn't require human labor in the fields under the hot sun, and the price of cotton collapsed. And therefore, the value of slaves collapsed. And slaves became more of an economic burden to their masters rather than an economic asset. He says, if that were to happen, how long do you think it would take before the slave owners would suddenly discover that the Bible was anti-slavery and that science was anti-slavery? His point being, if it's in our interest, then we're going to find that science and religion are on our side. If it's against our interest, we're going to find that science and religion are on the other side. And I'm afraid I take that view.
I would have to agree. I think one more rationalization that comes up in the book is interesting, and that is how many slave owners said, well, slavery is really wrong, so I'm going to set my slaves free after I die. So they put it in their will so that they could keep their slaves until the end of their life, but then they would set them free.
Right. Well, you're right. I agree with you. I would use the word rationalization, but at the same time, one of the things I try to do in this book, and maybe it's one of the more controversial aspects of this book, is to avoid telling this story as a good, pure, noble Christian people on the one hand versus demonic, ignoble, evil children of Satan on the other hand. That's an easy story. That's an easy story to tell. And as I like to say to my students, I'm in the confusion business. The fact of the matter is there were many people in the North who were against slavery, not because they were particularly concerned about the welfare or rights of black people, but because they were worried about the competition of unfree labor versus paid labor. I don't want slaves coming into my neighborhood because it's going to cost me my job.
Right.
I mean, in some ways, you get an echo or a parallel to the argument against immigration, large-scale immigration today, right? Yeah. And you had slave owners who lamented and regretted the circumstance that they were in a position of having a dozen or scores or sometimes hundreds of human beings dependent on them. And, it was unclear in some cases what was the right path forward. What was the solution to this problem? I mean, just saying, I'm going to emancipate my slaves. Well, if you're really serious about it, and some Southern slave owners did this, if you're going to emancipate them, you also have to commit yourself to education, support, relocation, provision of land and tools so that they could become landowners and farmers themselves. And, there were some people who were just not in a position either to imagine or to do that. So, I'm clearly, I think nobody can read this book without coming away with the sense that I'm appalled by the historical reality of slavery, and as you've been suggesting, rather impatient with the rationalizations that were used to defend it. But I don't think we get very far telling this as a good versus evil story. That slavery was an evil, No question about it. I don't see any possibility of a contrary argument there. But that every slave owner was evil, and that every anti-slavery Northerner was a child of God, full of love in his heart, that's an oversimplification, to put it mildly.
Yes, it is, and I think the pragmatics of the economy are well discussed and laid out in the book. I think it was interesting that the father of our country also thought slavery was bad, but he certainly wanted his slaves returned when the Tories and the other Brits were, taking them away.
That's right. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever met a human being who was not full of contradictions? Okay, right. Any human being who's perfectly consistent and always acts according to what he or she claims to believe? I've yet to meet such a person. There might be such people in the Bible or in literature or in heaven, but I don't think we know too many of them down here on Earth. So George Washington was a defective person. So was Thomas Jefferson. So was James Madison, and so were lots of abolitionists. Abraham Lincoln once argued a case on behalf of a slave owner when he was in law practice in Springfield. So, this is not a book about saints and sinners. This is a book about a very, very difficult problem that ensnared our country and led to a catastrophic war that, after the death of almost 1 million people, changed the circumstances and brought slavery to an end.
I think I've got about a minute left, and I did want to touch on the discussion you have about the Fugitive Slave Law and how that ultimately precipitated so much violence as slave hunters that were crossing over into the free territories to retrieve their slaves did, in fact, engage in an awful lot of violence, which probably precipitated the war as much as anything else did.
Well, right. There was violent resistance to the Fugitive Slave Law. There were mobs that broke fugitives out of prison and whisked them off onto what we call the Underground Railroad and sent them off, dispatched them off to Canada to find permanent sanctuary. So the Fugitive Slave Law plunged the country into turmoil. By the numbers, it wasn't very significant. You still had 3 million enslaved people and a few thousand fugitives annually fleeing to the north. But the spectacle of people taking the law into their own hands, resisting the courts, organizing resistance in the streets, that changed the tone of American politics and the tone of public discourse, and in my view, helped to lead toward the ultimate confrontation, which was the Civil War.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. We've been talking with Dr. Andrew Delbanco. The book is The War Before the War, Fugitive Slaves and the Struggle for America's Soul from the Revolution to the Civil War. It's a great read, very thoroughly researched, and very well written. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Delbanco. I remind our listeners that if you don't hear our regularly scheduled broadcasts, you can also catch our interviews on our YouTube channel, Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening. Now a special edition of Stories from Texas with Dr. William F. Strong.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. I will add what I can about the Texas perspective on slavery, pre-Civil War and post-Civil War. I'm just going to hit the highlights here to give you some food for thought. Before the Texas independence, before the Alamo, Southerners were moving into Texas and buying land from the impresarios, people like Stephen F. Austin. They wanted to bring their slaves, and there was a problem. Mexico owned Texas then, and Mexico was anti-slavery. It was a slave-free country. Many people from these early colonies where they settled in Austin Territory, etc., not the city of Austin, but where he, developed his lands according to legal rights given to him by the Mexican government to develop and sell land. These people would write to Austin, who was down in Mexico City at the time, and they asked him to ask Santa Anna to give them a special dispensation to bring slaves into the country. They said, we can't make it without our slaves. We cannot economically survive without their labor. But the Mexican government said no. And so what many of these people did is they brought their slaves with them anyway, and they had them sign papers converting themselves to indentured servants. So they could say, oh, well, he's not a slave, you see, he's an indentured servant. He owes a debt, and he's going to work that debt off over time, or she is going to work out the debt over time. But the problem was, you see, is that the debt that they inherited going from slave to indentured servant was so large that they couldn't possibly pay it off in their lifetime. And to add to this unique horror, the debt was inheritable, meaning that their children could assume the debt. And so they owed for their father, and they could, therefore, as the owner of the slaves, you could enslave them in perpetuity with these indentured servant plans. So, eventually, as the stresses between Santa Anna's new power as a kind of would-be monarch of Mexico, he negated the Constitution of 1824, which provided for a kind of states' rights in Mexico itself. And this is kind of how the Texas Rebellion began. It didn't begin really with the issue of slavery entirely, although that was certainly, for some, a part of it. A great deal of the concern was that they didn't want to be the subjects of a monarch like Santa Anna, or a dictator as they saw him. They had already escaped this in the United States as they escaped the dictatorial powers of King George, and so they weren't going to go through that again. And so they decided that they would fight rather than, in their minds, be enslaved to a dictator. So what happened? Of course, we have the Alamo, we have the fight for independence. And for all the horrors that Santa Anna brought to Texas, and for all his dictatorial excesses, and for all of his brutal killing of the defenders of the Alamo and Goliad, he did demonstrate one small act of civility that is surprising. You remember at the Alamo that everybody was killed except for a small group of women and children and perhaps 4 men. And it said that one of these 4 men was Joe, the slave of the commander, who was William Barrett Travis. So Santa Anna had the 3 men that remained who managed to surrender. He had them executed because he said he would take no prisoners. And however, he did give freedom to Joe, the slave. He said, I set you free. And so Joe went free, and actually he was free for about a year before he was recaptured after independence and returned, as they said at the time, to his rightful owners, which was the terminology used at the time. So Texas independence was about freedom from tyranny, but freedom really for just those who were not slaves. Hispanic Texas was overwhelmingly anti-slave, too. It was well known by the Anglo slaveholders that you wouldn't want to develop farms and plantations near Hispanic Texas because the slaves would run to Mexico in freedom, and the Hispanics would help them along the way as they, shall we say, were all kind of born abolitionists. So the slaveholding area remained toward East Texas. Sam Houston was against slavery, and when the Civil War broke out, he advised that Texas should stay out of it. It should certainly not join the Confederacy. Houston was shouted down and actually vilified as a kind of traitor because of his stance. He did not live until the end of the war to see his position vindicated, but he likely at least knew which way the prevailing winds were blowing by that time. He knew how it would turn out. So slavery, the slavery position of Texas, is even to this day being played out in toppled statues, renaming of schools with names like Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis, and removing of plaques that appear to honor Southern figures. Some say you can't sanitize or rewrite history. It is what it is. Some argue that descendants of slaves shouldn't have to attend schools with names of those who fought to enslave their ancestors. It is a complicated conflict, but so far, one that sends only arguments into battle rather than armies. I'm W.F. Strong. This is my quick take on the slavery issue in Texas, and of course it is much deeper and much more complex than I am able to cover in this short time, but it at least gives you a perspective on the major trends of thought through these times.